Why are the most spiritually gifted souls often born into the most painful families? Why do those with deep empathy, intuition, and vision often grow up surrounded by emotional chaos, control, or neglect? Why is the one who feels the most, often the black sheep, the misfit, the rebel, so frequently misunderstood, rejected, or even shamed by those closest to them? Comment 1 if you've ever been the black sheep who wouldn't play along. Comment 2 if you blended in but felt secretly different. When did you first sense that your difference was pointing you toward a deeper path? It's not a coincidence. It's a calling. In the language of depth psychology and spiritual initiation, pain isn't punishment. It's preparation. What looks like dysfunction is often a sacred forge. And what feels like rejection is often the start of a journey back to the self, what Carl Jung called individuation, the lifelong process of becoming the truest, most whole version of who you are, beyond roles, masks, and inherited patterns. Jung wrote that, "Man is not made by ease, but by conflict. The soul doesn't grow in comfort. It awakens through contrast." For some, that contrast begins at home. When your first environment is unstable, controlling, or unsafe, you're not being cursed, you're being initiated. The family, then, becomes the first spiritual battlefield. You were placed there not to conform, but to transform. Not to belong, but to see beyond. Not to carry the legacy of silence, but to end it. You are not the problem. You are the pattern breaker. The one who feels too much because you're meant to heal what's been ignored for generations. The one who doesn't fit in because you were never meant to. And this painful beginning is not the end. It is the threshold. The misfit is the messenger. In each of us, there is another whom we do not know. He speaks to us in dreams and tells us how differently he sees us. Carl Jung. You were the one who asked too many questions. The one who noticed what others ignored. The one who didn't laugh at the cruel jokes. The one who cried when the energy shifted in the room, even if no one said a word. In many dysfunctional families, there is one child who doesn't absorb the program, one who refuses to fully forget themselves to belong. That child is often cast as the misfit, but Jung would call them something else, the emerging self. In his model of the psyche, the self is not the ego. It's the totality of who you truly are, both conscious and unconscious. When a child begins to intuitively align with this deeper truth, even in an unsafe environment, they disrupt the family's fragile equilibrium. The ego structures of those around them feel threatened, not because the child is wrong, but because they're unconsciously revealing what others have long repressed. This is shadow activation in real time. The child who refuses to fake it activates the shame, fear, or denial others have buried. And in systems built on silence or control, this becomes intolerable. So the child is punished, pathologized, or shunned, not for misbehaving, but for being authentic. You weren't too sensitive. You were sensing too much. You weren't rebellious. You were resisting distortion. This rejection is not evidence of spiritual failure, but initiation. In mythology, the hero is rarely embraced at home. In Jungian terms, this is the beginning of individuation, the departure from the collective identity, the family's unconscious pattern, toward the truth of the inner self. And just like the archetypal wounded healer, it is often the pain of exile that awakens deeper perception. Here's the paradox. The one labeled too much is often the one most tuned into truth. The child who is hardest to control becomes the adult most capable of transforming systems, not despite their pain, but because of it. Comment 1 if pain has clarified your purpose. Comment 2 if you're still learning what your pain is trying to teach. What has your hardest season initiated in you? Pain is the portal to purpose. There is no coming to consciousness without pain. Carl Jung. What if the chaos wasn't blocking your path, but opening it? Most people think pain is a detour, a sign something has gone wrong. But in the spiritual psyche, and particularly through Jung's lens, Pain is the threshold, the sacred crack in the ego that lets in light. In families where love is conditional, emotions are dismissed, or manipulation is normalized, the child learns early that the world is not safe. But instead of breaking them, this realization often leads to an inner awakening. In psychology, this is trauma-induced resilience. In Jungian terms, it is the call of the self beginning to stir beneath the ruins of inherited scripts. When the outer world becomes unbearable, the soul turns inward. This is not escapism, it's survival. And eventually, that inward retreat becomes a temple. For many spiritually gifted individuals, the first true sense of connection, love, and truth comes not from parents or siblings, but from silence, from dreams, from the invisible presence that whispers, "There is more than this." Jung believed that the unconscious compensates for what consciousness lacks. When the external environment is void of safety, the psyche activates its own sanctuary. This is the birth of spiritual intuition, and it's why so many empaths, mystics, and healers report early life suffering followed by inner breakthroughs. Pain sharpens perception, chaos tests conviction, and rejection removes illusions. The family system, in this view, becomes a kind of alchemical cauldron, not meant to destroy you, but to transform you, not to shame you into silence, but to provoke a fire that won't go out. The very things that were meant to break you become the catalysts for a life of truth, depth, and spiritual authority. You didn't become powerful in spite of the pain. You became powerful through it. And that pain, it wasn't punishment. It was the portal. The shadow is born at home. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Carl Jung: the first shadows we meet are not our own. They're projected onto us. Before we learn language, we absorb vibration. And for those born into emotionally volatile, manipulative, or dismissive families, the atmosphere itself becomes the first teacher. You learn quickly that certain truths, your emotions, intuitions, sensitivities, are not welcome. In fact, they're dangerous. So, you do what every child must. You adapt. But adaptation comes at a cost. You hide what's real to stay safe. You bury what's true to stay loved. Jung called this repression the beginning of the shadow, the part of the psyche that holds everything we disown in order to survive. But in toxic families, the shadow isn't just internal. It's systemic. When a child mirrors back the dysfunction, by crying, questioning, or refusing to comply, they often become the scapegoat. This is not random. This is projection. The family, unwilling to face its own unconscious material, offloads it onto the most awake member. You are too emotional because no one else dares to feel. You are selfish because you finally said no. You are crazy because you see through the lies. This dynamic is not just psychological, it's archetypal. In myth, the truth teller is cast out. In fairy tales, the cursed one is secretly chosen. In Jungian theory, the scapegoat often holds the key to healing the entire system, if they can survive the projection long enough to reclaim their own reflection. To bring the shadow to light is to refuse to carry what was never yours. It means recognizing that the shame, guilt, or confusion you internalized does not originate from you. It was inherited, imprinted, passed down like an unconscious heirloom. And it's in recognizing this pattern that the alchemy begins. You were not the family's problem. You were its mirror. And your task was never to fix them, only to see clearly enough to free yourself. Because in the Jungian journey, what we make conscious loses its power to control us. Spiritual immunity is forged in dysfunction. Even a happy life cannot be without a measure of darkness. And the word happy would lose its meaning if it were not balanced by sadness. Carl Jung: some people inherit wealth, others wisdom. But the spiritually gifted? They inherit chaos and learn to transmute it into clarity. When love is inconsistent and truth is punished, the soul begins a quiet rebellion. Not one of violence, but of inner insulation, a building of boundaries where none existed. This is the emergence of what we might call spiritual immunity, the sacred ability to remain anchored in your inner truth, even while the world around you denies it. In toxic families, survival often requires developing a hyper-attuned sensitivity to emotional shifts. Who's angry? Who's lying? Who's hurting? While exhausting, this vigilance is not weakness. It is the training ground for spiritual discernment. Jung described this process as the confrontation with the collective unconscious, the shared, inherited patterns that shape behavior without awareness. When a child begins to question these unconscious contracts, why can't we talk about real things? Why am I being blamed for feeling? They're not just reacting, they're individuating. But individuation requires rejection. You learn to stop seeking validation from people who invalidate your essence. You stop contorting yourself into roles you were never meant to play. You begin to listen, not outward, but inward. And this inward turn is where the sacred begins. Your connection to a higher self, source, or divine intelligence becomes your tether. Your inner knowing becomes louder than their gaslighting. And the more you return to this core, the more immune you become, not in a cold, armored way, but in a spiritually sovereign one. Spiritual immunity means not absorbing others' shame as your truth, not chasing love that demands your silence, not apologizing for existing differently. It is the invisible backbone you grow in the face of invisible wounds. The irony: those who tried to diminish your light inadvertently made it unshakable. In trying to erase your identity, they etched it deeper. In dismissing your voice, they trained you to trust it even more. You were not broken in that chaos. You were being built, not for their world, but for your own. The chosen one is placed in the storm. The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Carl Jung. Some souls aren't sent to peaceful families. They're assigned to battlegrounds, not as punishment, but as purpose. In dysfunctional family systems, there is often one person, usually a child, who refuses to lose themselves to the collective script. This person may be criticized, shamed, or ignored. But underneath that conflict lies a deeper pattern. The family unconsciously resists awakening, and the presence of someone more conscious threatens the unconscious order. In Jungian psychology, this dynamic reflects the clash between the ego-driven persona, the socially acceptable mask, and the emerging self, the true, integrated identity. The chosen one disrupts the family's persona. They see too much, feel too deeply, and question too bravely. They are not the storm, but they activate it. Not because they want to cause trouble, but because their very being challenges suppression. They reflect what others don't want to face. This is what makes them dangerous in the eyes of the system, and sacred in the eyes of the soul. The chosen one archetype in mythology and psychology is not about superiority. It's about responsibility. Responsibility to end what has been recycled for generations, to name what others silence, to feel what others numb, to embody what others abandoned. This task is rarely welcomed. Often, it feels like betrayal. But betrayal of dysfunction is loyalty to truth. These individuals are placed not where it's easy, but where it's essential. Because the work isn't just personal, it's ancestral. Jung spoke of complexes, psychic structures formed by unresolved emotional energy, often passed down. The chosen one doesn't just carry their own wounds, they inherit the family's unhealed legacy. And yet, something within them says, "This ends with me." They may not know why they feel so different, why they break the rules others follow blindly, or why their pain feels larger than life. But they know they can't go back to sleep. They weren't born to uphold the system. They were born to outgrow it. To outgrow guilt without losing empathy. To outgrow silence without losing love. To outgrow dysfunction without losing connection to soul. You weren't sent into the storm. You are the calm within it. The chaos wasn't your curse. It was your classroom. The scapegoat is the system's soul bearer. The individual who wishes to have an answer to the problem of evil must not evade self-knowledge. Carl Jung. In every dysfunctional family, there is usually one person who carries the emotional weight of the entire system. They are blamed for problems they didn't cause, shamed for speaking truths no one else wants to face, punished for refusing to play by rules written in fear. That person is the scapegoat. But in Jungian language, they are much more. The unwelcome healer, the psychic truth-teller, the one tasked, consciously or not, with bearing the shadow of the family. Jung defined the shadow as the unconscious part of the psyche that holds repressed emotions, instincts, and truths. In a toxic family, this shadow is never owned. It's projected. And the scapegoat becomes the living mirror of everything the family cannot or will not acknowledge. You were the problem because you wouldn't pretend there wasn't one. While others bonded through denial, you chose honesty. While others stayed silent to be safe, you risked exile for truth. While others played roles, you searched for reality. This makes the scapegoat dangerous to the unconscious system, but vital to its potential transformation. In mythology, the scapegoat is ritually cast out, not because they failed, but because they exposed what the tribe refused to face. In depth psychology, this mirrors the archetype of the wounded healer, the one who gains power not by escaping pain, but by walking through it consciously. But here's the tragedy. The scapegoat is often the most emotionally intelligent, the most spiritually awake, the most fiercely loyal to truth. They don't want to destroy the family. They want to liberate it. And yet, to fulfill this role, they must first liberate themselves. The moment the scapegoat stops internalizing blame is the moment healing begins, not just for themselves, but potentially for the lineage. In this sense, the scapegoat becomes an alchemist of ancestral pain, turning shame into wisdom and rejection into radiant clarity. You were not cast out because you were broken. You were cast out because you were whole in a place that forgot how to be. And your wholeness, unbought, unsilenced, unshaken, is the medicine the system didn't know it needed. Compassion is born through contrast. Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darkness of other people. Carl Jung, you didn't learn love because it was modeled perfectly. You learned it because you survived its absence. One of the paradoxes of spiritual evolution is that those who become the most compassionate are often those who've been wounded the most. In dysfunctional families, where manipulation, coldness, or emotional withholding are normalized, the sensitive soul has only two options: collapse or awaken. In Jungian terms, this is where the anima, animus, the inner feminine, or masculine soul image, begins to activate. The external world becomes emotionally unsafe, so the psyche develops an inner guide, one that whispers, "You are not what they call you. You are not alone. You are love," even if they never taught you how to receive it. This inner guide is not just imagination, it's spiritual compensation. It is how the self begins to reparent the inner child, forming a sanctuary inside long before it's found outside. And here's the mystery. Those who've endured cruelty often become the most attuned to kindness. Why? Because they've known what it means to be unloved and still choose to love. They've seen manipulation dressed as care and vowed never to offer that to others. They've felt the sting of being unheard and now offer deep listening as an act of soul. This is how pain becomes purpose. The child once accused of being too sensitive becomes the adult who can sense truth without words. The one ridiculed for crying becomes the one who holds space for others' grief. The one gaslit into doubting their intuition becomes the one others come to for guidance. Empathy is no longer a weakness, it becomes sacred intelligence. But this depth of feeling doesn't just appear, it is forged in contrast. You recognize real love because you survived its opposite. You recognize safety because you've known danger. You recognize truth because you've been steeped in lies. And that recognition becomes a gift, not just for you, but for those you will serve, guide, and heal. You didn't become empathetic by accident. Comment 1 if your empathy now feels like a strength. Comment 2 if it still feels overwhelming at times. How are you learning to trust your sensitivity without losing yourself? You became that way because your soul refused to close. Survival becomes sovereignty. Man's task is to become conscious of the contents that press upward from the unconscious. Carl Jung. You didn't just survive what tried to break you, you outgrew it. There comes a turning point on the spiritual path where you realize healing isn't about becoming who you were before the wound. It's about becoming someone who could only exist because of the wound. Someone forged in contrast, refined in fire, rooted in soul. This is the moment survival becomes sovereignty. Carl Jung spoke of the individuation process as the integration of all parts of the psyche, light and shadow, pain and power, instinct and spirit, into a unified, conscious whole. And for those born into toxic systems, this journey is not abstract. It's visceral, daily, earned. You stop needing apologies to be free. You stop needing validation to feel worthy. You stop shrinking to keep others comfortable. This is not rebellion. It's remembrance. You're not abandoning anyone. You're reclaiming yourself. The family may never understand. The system may never change. But your nervous system does. Your frequency does. Your reality does. Because now, you are living not from reaction, but from truth. The roles assigned to you, caretaker, invisible one, overachiever, peacemaker, are seen for what they are, survival mechanisms, not soul truths. And in naming them, you loosen their grip. You begin to create, not just cope, to feel, not just function, to express, not just endure. This is the essence of Jung's model. When unconscious patterns are made conscious, we stop being puppets of the past and start becoming authors of the future. And perhaps most powerful of all, you become a mirror not of your family's shadow, but of what's possible beyond it. You model unconditional love in the face of betrayal. You hold boundaries without bitterness. You choose clarity over control and peace over people-pleasing. You're no longer surviving dysfunction. You're outgrowing it. Not in spite of where you came from, but because you had the courage to keep becoming. You were never meant to stay in the roles they gave you. You were meant to transcend them. Everything, the rejection, the chaos, the emotional scarcity, was not the end of your story. It was the initiation, the sacred rupture that cracked the ego's illusions and invited the deeper self to emerge. Jung taught that healing is not becoming good. It's becoming whole. And wholeness requires the integration of pain, not the avoidance of it. You were chosen, not because you were flawless, but because you had the capacity to carry contradiction, to walk through darkness without losing your light. Your childhood may have felt like exile, but your soul recognized it as training. And now, what once wounded you becomes wisdom. What once silenced you becomes voice. What once confused you becomes clarity. You begin to embody what Jung called the individuated self, not a perfect person, but a conscious one. You were not cursed by your family. You were commissioned by your soul to end the cycle, to shift the story, to remember that you are not here to fit in. You are here to wake up. This is the alchemy of the chosen one, to turn inherited pain into generational power. What if your life was never off track? What if every moment of confusion, pain, and exile was part of a deeper choreography, an ancestral assignment your soul accepted long before you could speak? Carl Jung believed that the unconscious would continue to rule our lives until we brought it to light. In choosing to awaken inside a dysfunctional family, you were not only confronting the personal unconscious, you were stepping into the collective shadow. The patterns no one spoke of, the pain no one dared name. And yet, here you are, awake, feeling, healing, becoming. You are not here to fix others. You're here to free yourself. Not here to be understood. You're here to understand. Not here to be chosen by them. You were chosen by something greater. You don't need their permission to heal. You don't need their apology to rise. You don't need the family to reflect your light for it to shine. Because you were never meant to reflect your family. You were born to redefine what family can mean. So what now? Now, you live boldly. Now you love wisely. Now you protect your light as fiercely as you once begged others to see it. Keep the cord to source strong. Return to it when the world grows cold. Speak truth, even if your voice shakes. Rest, even when the guilt whispers. Create beauty from the ruins. Make meaning from the silence. And above all, remember who you are. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Carl Jung. You are not broken. You are blooming. You are not too much. You are exactly enough. You are not alone. You are part of a sacred lineage of soul awakeners. This is your time. This is your truth. This is your turning point. Welcome home to yourself. Comment 1 if you're ready to break a generational pattern. Comment 2 if your first step is simply honoring your worth. What one concrete action will you take this week to live from yourself?